Waleed Aly, thanks very much for coming in and talking to Business Spectator.
Thanks for having me.
I mean, are you driven by the role that you have assumed as a representative, and not a sole representative, but as a representative of the Muslim community in Australia? It is underrepresented in the media. Would you agree with that?
It's definitely underrepresented. Well, no, it's not underrepresented. It's just represented in very specific ways. It's not hard to get media attention as a Muslim. You just need to say or do something crazy.
Yes, but it's underrepresented in the full flow of public debate.
Exactly, yes. So it's sort of cordoned off or quarantined into a particular area that's not particularly flattering. And yeah, that's an issue. But, you know, I've sort of reached a point where I don't think of myself as a representative of the Muslim community or anything else, really. I was officially a representative for a few years, up to about 2007. And then I stopped being that. I still get asked questions about it and I'll respond, but I tend to respond more as an analyst or as a commentator, and I feel comfortable doing that. I mean, I don't turn up for a radio shift or for a TV program thinking, you know, how can I be a Muslim broadcaster today?
No, but are you aware of it? Are you aware of the responsibility you carry?
Not when I'm doing it. I sort of become aware afterwards.
Right.
You know, when I meet someone in the street and they sort of tell me, you know, some of the most touching feedback I've had has been from, you know, young, or the parents of young Muslim kids, or even non-Muslim kids who are just not, you know, Anglo-Celtic extraction, who will just say how much it gives them to hear someone with a name as funny as theirs,
yes,
you know, in the seat doing broadcasting.
Yes, in a visible position. Tell me about, let's talk about that for a moment, but from the business and economics perspective, which is our audience here. In terms of post-GFC global plays, in terms of geopolitics post-GFC, has the GFC changed the relationship, if you like, between the West and the Muslim world?
Well, it depends, I think, where you are in the West. But I wouldn't say that it was necessarily the GFC that's made this change. I mean, if you look at, for example, the booming area of Islamic finance, you know, which really Dubai is kind of right in the middle of, but not just that. I mean, in Southeast Asia it's happening as well. These were creating links between the Muslim world and the Western world that were strong and extremely profitable, which was the main thing. And so in London you had Citibank, for instance, getting right into this market. And London banks generally were really, HSBC also being a global bank, they were really interested in this. Australia didn't. Australia never really participated in this. We don't have the legal framework for it.
I thought some of our big four banks had made efforts at least.
They've started, but they're a long way behind. And we just, you know, the legal framework in Australia, I think it's been changing. Government's sort of slowly been amending in this area. But it hasn't been in a position to capitalise on it. Because, you know, so I think it was, you know, a few years ago, the Victorian government, for instance, made some stamp duty amendments to mean that Islamic financial transactions, which are not based on interest, but are based on equity finance, that they could be commercially competitive. And so those sorts of things were happening, but it's pretty small, it's pretty piecemeal, and Australia is not taking advantage of that. Singapore is really interested. So it's happening in our region. I mean, Malaysia's involved, but Australia sort of hasn't been. But if you go to America or the US or the UK, this sort of stuff's big.
So it requires further national legal reform, does it, for it to fully take off as such or fulfill its potential? Yeah, well, I'm not sure what the current state legislation is, but last time I looked at it a few years ago, there was definitely work to be done. Just because the financial transactions are different, so that property passes more times than once, for instance, and that has legal consequences that cost money in Australia that you don't have, for example, in the UK. But the UK, I think, because the banks cottoned onto this very quickly. And you're talking a lot of money. I mean, you're talking about corporations like Emirates wanting to raise capital to buy a new fleet of planes, and they want to do it via Islamic financial instruments, for instance. Right. That's a lot of money to be made there if you can get in. It's actually a fascinating area which is certainly covered in the financial media. Can I ask you also, on this geopolitical dimension, the decline of the US post-GFC, it's tangible. The decline of the US, the rise of Asia, particularly the rise of China. How does that bear upon the dynamics we're talking about the relationship between the West and Muslim institutions?
Well, I think it's going to be very interesting geopolitically, because as the West, particularly as the US declines as a political and economic power, a question that I've asked a lot but don't know what the answer is well, how does that impact, for example, the Middle East peace process? If China starts to emerge, and China's already investing in the Middle East and in Africa and just about everywhere, and it's building relationships. There are lots of people in China who are becoming Middle East specialists, who are speaking Arabic, for instance, and learning Arabic and teaching it. So this is a focus for China. So if China decides to become more than an economic power and become a serious political power, its imperatives, its decision-making process, its political judgment is very different to that of the US. And so what does that mean for a nation like Israel? I mean, that's anybody's guess. What does it mean for Egypt? Egypt's a really interesting example. I mean, you've just had an uprising. I don't think it's quite a revolution yet.
Yes.
You've just had an uprising. It's going to have to create a new future at some point, at least it's trying to do that. In the past, its political establishment has been highly reliant on US support and US aid. Does that change? If that changes, what does the Egyptian government look like? I mean, there are far more questions than answers here when you've got a GFC and you've got the Arab Spring, and that just means uncertainty.
Do you feel our business leaders generally in Australia are aware, are au fait with these deeper changes that are running and occurring before our eyes?
Well, I mean, you'd spend more time talking to business leaders than I do. My impression, though, is that they're not really focused on these sorts of things, and particularly not in the Middle East. I mean, there just hasn't been a huge focus on the Middle East in my experience. Now, I might be looking in the wrong places, but, you know, I think individual Australians are. I mean, I lost count of the number of colleagues when I was a lawyer that disappeared to the Middle East to take up legal positions that were extremely well paid,
right.
You know, with magic circle law firms that happen to be operating in the Middle East at the time, you know, things like that. So I think individuals are kind of cottoning onto it. But I don't see really a shift in the business community. And I think the thing that we spoke about before about Islamic finance is a good example of that. Yes. The fact that we haven't really been cottoned onto that, I think demonstrates there is at least some kind of blind spot in play.
Waleed Aly, thank you very much for talking to Business Spectator.
Thanks for having me.